Good morning. We're going to go back to Southeast Asia again. And this time we're looking beyond the extended family or clan houses to other architectures in South Asia, Southeast Asia. There are a number of kinds of architecture, and of course they vary in a regional way from each other, but very widespread in Southeast Asia is this kind of roof. And it becomes hard to understand it, how to explain it. Is it to shade the gable end from the sun? But some of them look as though they're so extreme in their cantilever art that they can't just be to shade the gable end. So what possible function do they have? And you notice if you look at the ends of some of them, that they're very elaborately constructed. What is very characteristic is that the overhanging gable is actually propped up on a pole that is outside the building because it extends so far out. And also that there are some characteristic features on the pole and that related to the gable, of which you can see here two rather clearly. The first one is the buffalo horns, and in fact these buffalo horns are attached to a skull, a buffalo skull. And then immediately behind them is a long sloping pole which actually has a bird's head on the end of it, although you can't see it here. You see it there again. This is another building, very decorated, and you see that there is a buffalo's head with horns, and you see again the long neck of the crane going up to the crane's head, which is off the picture. Here is the same thing again. Here we have more than one buffalo's set of horns, and the crane's head is dark and high up and hard to see. Here you can just see the crane's head coming up at an angle, but what is really interesting is the fact that the pole has been cut off. So you now have a suspended pole with no base to it. These are huge overhanging eaves, but of course the buildings are very small because they are storehouses for grain. They're not actually buildings for living in or using. So the overhanging gable is the very characteristic feature, but nearly always associated with the buffalo horns and the bird, the long-necked bird, the crane. Sometimes that association isn't so clear, but that is unusual. The buildings are made out of bamboo. A huge percentage of the building is made out of bamboo. The leaves for the roof, of course the bamboos themselves tied together for the uprights in many cases, and then horizontally for the screening. Bamboo is an incredible material. And you can also use, of course, the stem for carving. Now, when you actually study these buildings, as the Dutch did 100 years ago in Indonesia very carefully, then you discover that there's something very curious about the way they're built. They're not built straight up from the ground as a rule. They are resting on four verticals which are supporting a horizontal platform which is much smaller than the platform of the building itself, because the platform of the building itself cantilevers out. You can see that in section, and the way it cantilevers is that there is a raised seat around the central platform, all the way around. And there are two other features that are very interesting. The first is that the building is approached not up a staircase, but up a notched log, just like a gangplank. Secondly, the cooking is done in metal trays set into the raised seat. Now that's not surprising because after all the building is highly inflammable, isn't it? So if you're going to have any cooking done there, they would have to be protected from the timber would have to be protected from the fire. So metal trays are used. But you, if you haven't already read the readings, you will see immediately an association between these houses and boats, because that kind of a plan in which you have a raised seat around a central flat area with metal trays for any cooking is very characteristic of boats, isn't it? And indeed the gangplank gives it away too, the notched log. So I don't need to go any further but without drawing attention to the fact that even if you don't have the overhanging eaves, and in this particular example of a temple you don't, what you have is a sort of vestige of them in the ridge piece. But even if you don't have the overhanging eaves, the building is really designed on the same principle as a boat, and very reminiscent of a boat in the way you use it. Now, isn't that curious? Why would people do that? Why would the generative concept involve a symbol of a boat? Interesting. Here in these sections are clearer for the way in which the building is actually supported on 4 rocks with 4 little frames underneath, and then the whole building is cantilevered out, and you have the raised seat around the central platform. And that's what they're looking like inside. Now, frequently the drawings I have are of temples, but this draws attention to an important principle we will find over and over again, which is that religious buildings are usually perfected houses, houses that are made bigger and neater and grander, but basically the same. Now here you see the notched logs are placed side by side to give you a very grand entrance, but it's still a gangplank. Notice the symmetry here. So it's obviously meant to be a grander building. But one has no difficulty in seeing from the scale of the roof that the whole building is conceived around the roof shape. It's a terribly important part of the building. And there's the raised seat. These are old, ruined buildings. Now we get a clue as to where the construction and the form comes from looking at stored boats. Now, why would boats be stored? Because part of the year there is very bad weather, and it's not safe to leave the boats even on the beach. So if they're important boats and you want to protect them, you have to move them inland a bit and put them on some sort of a raised platform. But there would be some boats for which this was more important than others. And those boats would be the ceremonial boats. Now, it's not difficult to believe that people who are maritime people use special ceremonies for marriage, for celebrating events, even for funerals, out on the water. If you know anything about the history of Venice, you know that that was true of Venice. All the great ceremonies happened in boats on the water in Venice. And there were special boats for that purpose. Well, the same was true in many other cultures, including the one we're looking at. Notice how it resembles a house in the fact that the boat is stabilized on shore by having a pole tied to the 2 gables to steady the boat against the wind. And of course the thatched roof over the boat to protect it from the weather while it's in storage is very reminiscent of the buildings we've seen. So the prototype for the houses and the temples seems to be stored ceremonial boats, and they can get very elaborate and very grand. These are in central Java. And here we are looking at the gable end, and you see the extraordinary proliferation of buffalo horns, and also that the gable end is treated like the stern of a boat, very similar in the way it's treated visually. And right in front, but only just visible, is the crane, a long-necked bird. Amazing construction, isn't it? Even in the storehouses that are related to those grand buildings, you still get some sense of the grandeur. And this is not a storehouse, this is a bridge. The whole bridge is covered by a roof. And the roof is treated the same way at the ends with these overhanging gables. Now, where does it all come from? What does it mean? Well, to understand it, you have to actually see what the life was like in these towns, in the villages that were building these houses and these bridges. Well, first of all, the shrines were always shaped like boats, and stored boats at that. And inside the shrine was nearly always a bronze representation of a boat, with the rowers being represented in the casting. And you see the captain up on the bridge. And there are lots of these cast bronze boats surviving, images surviving as shrines. Now, where did they come from? They certainly weren't made on the remote islands of Indonesia, were they? They weren't going to do bronze casting there. So they had to come from somewhere else. And indeed, we know where they came from. The great center of bronze casting was the mouth of the Red River, South China and North Vietnam. And one of the cultures bordering that river was called the Dong Song culture, at the mouth of the river. And it was famous for the extent to which it involved itself in trade. We depend to a large extent on legend to understand the importance of the Dong Song culture. We know that the Han dynasty in China regarded it as a major victory when they conquered the Dong Song people. But the Dong Song trading went on after that. And we are quite certain from the evidence that's been found in the area of Dong Song itself in the Red River that many of these objects we're talking about came from there. In other words, the Dong Song people traded in bronze castings. And the main trade was in bronze gongs and in bronze vessels. Bronze vessels, of course, were used for ritual feasts. So you could have a huge bronze vessel for the whole community, for the hot rice, for a great communal feast. And the gongs were used to summon people to rituals and to prayer. And then they obviously made objects like these. Now, the making of these objects must have been a fairly late development because it represents a need which was felt out in the islands, in remote settlements. And that need was to represent the ancestors sailing to the islands before the settlement was made. Spirits of the ancestors sailing back to their homeland after their death. So these are associated with very elaborate funeral rites in which the dead were placed in a boat made of wood on land, which was then thought to convey them back to their homeland. So they're vessels representing the nostalgia of another time, of another age, when their ancestors sailed the oceans before the settlements were made. Now you would think that the Dong Song settlements were only on the shores of the islands, but that isn't true. Because of warfare and competing for territory over many centuries, a lot of the villages are inland. And so you get these boat villages inland, perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 miles inland, which are still hankering for the ocean and the sea. And they build houses which are like boats to remind them of that, and particularly temples which are like boats. But it's much more elaborate even than that. So let's go on. Now here are the ceremonies that take place on the water. If two people wish to be betrothed from different villages, then the two vessels will go out, one from each village, and the betrothed couple will join hands from the boats, and the ceremony takes place, representing the bonding of the two villages. Similarly, there are ceremonies like that to celebrate the beginning of the new season, to celebrate births, important births and important deaths as well. So there are lots of ceremonies that take place using special boats. And you'll notice the boats are rather elaborate with very high prows and very high sterns. Now, such ceremonial boats are then often represented, and this is clearly a temple, and the entrance is being accentuated by representing a ceremonial boat at the entrance in some detail. Similarly, in the funeral boats, the buildings used for the funerary, the laying out of the dead and the funerary service, the beams are treated as boats with figures of oarsmen and of sailors standing in the boats. So there is a typical platform on which the dead are laid out. By the way, in that most of those societies, they are not buried. They're laid out and exposed to wild birds to pick the skeletons clean. And when the skeleton is clean, then the skeleton is buried. So that is a typical representation of a boat in a funeral platform. It's obviously symbolic only at the ends. Next. But there are many doorsteps, particularly for temples, which are shaped like boats. So now we go back to the question of where does the idea of the buffalo horns and the crane come from? Well, it comes from a very widely held belief in Southeast Asia that seems to come from India, but may not entirely come from India, but it's very, very ancient. Again, long before writing was developed. And that is that the ocean was a dangerous place. And the danger of the ocean was represented in ancient mythology in the form of a very powerful snake, which was in various cultures called by different names, but often has something to do with the word naga, N-A-G-A. So this very dangerous snake that was out in the ocean was enough to put most people in Southeast Asia and most people in India and Ceylon off sailing altogether, of going out into the ocean. And you may know the Indian Mutiny. One of the causes of the Indian Mutiny was the British Army sending Hindu soldiers out into the ocean to go from the east side of India to the west side and back and vice versa. And the Indian soldiers objected to it because of Naga. They were scared of going into the ocean. So how did the Dong Song sailors gather the courage to go out to trade in distant places? They gathered the courage by defending themselves with safety symbols. These people had the symbol of the buffalo and the crane. Why the buffalo and the crane? It's a very long, complicated legend, but basically, Naga was eventually defeated by Shiva's their sort of Shiva's emblems of support, and among the symbols of support for Shiva were the buffalo and the crane. To the extent that in the sculptures of Shiva, you nearly always see a representation of a snake around the neck, a defeated snake. So Naga, the sea serpent, was in one of the legends defeated by a snake, by a buffalo, and in another legend defeated by the crane. So these two gave protection to sailors. and were on the boats. So the prow of the boat in the ancient cultures seems to have always been a crane, traveling through the ocean, symbolizing something that would give fear to the snake naga in the ocean. And also, frequently, a buffalo head on the prow of the boat for the same reason. So, to reinforce the image of a boat on land, when they made these houses and temples look like boats, they put the crane prow and the buffalo head in front. Now that is true of the houses over and the temples over a very wide area. These go from Malaya through the whole of Indonesia, parts of the Philippines, into nearly all the parts of Indochina, up through Vietnam, and then into China itself, and as you'll see in a moment, even as far as Japan. So presumably they were spread by the Dong Song traders, these images. Now the idea of the boat as a protective symbol can extend to the point where in some villages they make offerings to the gods. From the tops of the temples you have offerings which made in the form of a boat. You remember that we saw last week in Hawaii, or maybe in the first week, in Hawaii there were offering bowls at the tops of towers. And here is an offering bowl at the top of a house, of a temple, which is made in the form of a boat. Now here is a representation of a fairly recent boat, but it has all of the characteristics that we've seen. And then there are various ways you can represent a boat. You can actually focus on the ridge. You don't have to make the whole building look like a boat. You can make just the ridge look like a boat. And you can symbolize the buffalo horns by simply having two wooden members at the ends of the ridge to symbolize buffalo horns. And in these diagrams you get an example of the huge range of ways in which you could represent boats or symbols from boats throughout the whole of Southeast Asia and round into Asia itself, round into South Asia. But New Guinea shouldn't be left out. New Guinea also came under this influence. And in New Guinea, you find that the boat form roof is used for the most important buildings in the communities, which were the buildings for the initiation of the young. The communal buildings used for the great gatherings of boys and girls at the moment of initiation into adulthood. And in these great communal buildings, you have all of the elements that we've been talking about. Notice the support of the gable on extraordinarily tall bamboos at the end there. Next. And here you see one under construction of immense size, because of course they had to accommodate several hundred youth or girls. And you get some without the supporting pole, but they're still clearly derived from the same tradition. Now in some villages, and these are up in Cambodia, the overhanging eaves are most clear in the temple and not so clear in the houses. They're reserved for the temple. Sometimes both the houses and the temple have them. And here's again the temple in the center of the village. Notice that the gangplank has become a kind of ramp now. We still have the freestanding pole carrying the overhanging cable. But that symbolism is carried on even to the village itself. And that must draw our attention to something very important about this. What are these boats doing? They're reminding people of their origin, these boat buildings. They're reminding people that they belong to a community. And so what better way of enforcing that memory of a community origin than by having the whole village in the form of a boat? And then they will go further, and they will actually name the elders of the village as the crew of the boat. So the chief of the village becomes the boatswain or the captain of the boat, and the various elders are named by different parts of the boat. And you'll see all that is spelled out in the article in your reader. Now, in some cases, the village has been moved, and there's a good reason why it is moved, and that is that the cemetery is in the center of the village in this particular kind of tradition. So on the right-hand edge, you have an old cemetery, and the village has been moved to the left. But in moving it, they've created the sense of the boat moving with a wake made of stone paths. The new cemetery is still in the middle of the village. The temple is number 10, the main gathering house of the village. And then, as you can see, the other houses are gathered around it. And nearly all of the villages which have any suggestion of having boat houses or boat temples have something like this in the plan of the village. Now, I should point out at this point that we're not talking about all of the buildings in all of South Asia. We're talking about those buildings that are relics of the Dongsong culture. And that represents about a third of all the villages in Southeast Asia. The other 2/3 do not belong to this tradition and don't build, or didn't traditionally build, boat roof houses or boat roof temples. Not initially, anyway. Later on, they got, obviously, there were influences across. But it's quite clear when you study that, when people have studied their villages, that only about a third of them are really Dongsong descended villages. Now, the idea that a conceptual origin for a building could be a boat is not as strange as you might think. And I want to show you some other examples where that has happened. Now, here is the great Buddhist gathering hall of early Buddhism called a Chaicha hall. You see how it's spelled at the bottom line, Chaicha. And a Chaicha hall, while being a columned hall, had a very curious roof. Here you can see the columns and the lintel, very beautifully decorated, supporting a very plain roof, which is like an upturned boat, very clearly like an upturned boat, because one of the characteristics of boats is that the ribs are fairly close together for strength. Now these, of course, what you're looking at here is executed in natural rock. It's carved into caves, and that's why we have it. We don't have any surviving wooden Chaicha hall because they stopped building them in the early centuries AD in India. So we don't have any of them surviving in the original form as decorated as that. But the ones that are stone cut out of natural rock give a very clear evidence that there's a big contrast between the lower levels of the building and the roof, the ceiling construction. And that suggests that they are really trying to maintain the image of an upturned boat over the Chaicha hall. Now, there may have been a practical reason why the roof of the Chaicha hall was made of an upturned boat. And that may have been that it was simply a very big span, and they had to find a way of building it economically. Now, one of the characteristic things about boats is that they don't normally have a very long life. They start to leak, they start to give trouble in various sections, And usually after about 30 years, a boat has to be rebuilt or abandoned. A very common practice then was to sell the old boat timbers for use in buildings, in architecture. We know that that's the case because we have so many examples of that in Europe and America, in the old buildings. You can't get better seasoned wood than wood that's been out on the water for 30 years. It is marvelously reusable wood. But naturally, a lot of it is, particularly in traditional buildings, in traditional boats, is very curved wood. It's not straight. They got around that in Elizabethan times by using the curved members for decorating the front of the building with in the half timbering. But what would be even cleverer would be to use the curved buildings to span the big halls of the church halls. And so that seems to have been what they did. And so we have this tradition of an association between the grand lower levels of a church hall and the very plain roof as being the association between the great rivers of India and the growth of the religion. It could well be that the church hall goes back to a very early phase of Buddhism in a much simpler form than you see here. And it would then have been very much in a part of Buddhist ideology to reuse boat timbers for the roof. We'll come back to that when we come to talk about Buddhism. So here is a typical natural rock church hall with its strange roof. But that's not the only parallel that we can produce evidence for. This is not an original Viking building. It is a reconstruction of one. But it's reconstructed on the foundations of the original. Of course, it was in timber again and wouldn't have survived into modern times. But what is curious about it are two facts. First, that it is shaped like a boat, and even more strange, that it has buffalo horns at the ends represented. And this is in Denmark. And there's another one reconstructed in Sweden. Well, it's not so surprising that they had boat buildings, because after all, the whole culture of the Vikings was a boat culture, wasn't it? And they had crews who had to remain loyal to each other, large crews, between 50 and 100 people. And they had to remain loyal to each other. So what would be more natural than when they came ashore for the winter, they would stay together in one building with their wives and children. And the winters are very long and hard in the Baltic. So there was a need to protect themselves from the weather, which they did in these well-built buildings. But where does the, sorry?
When you say that these were reconstructed, where was the evidence coming from? Like...
They did find bits, and also there were some engravings representing them.
Okay.
Actually, since this was done, they have found more evidence than they had originally. I think it may be slightly wrong, but anyway, basically right. But where does the symbolism of buffalo horns come from? That's really a big enigma. Why do they treat the gable ends the same way as they did in South Asia and Southeast Asia? Very strange, isn't it? Well, may not be so strange. If you were a fit young Viking youth, you might be enrolled in the royal guard of the emperors in Byzantium, the Byzantine emperors, who were always Scandinavians. The royal guard in Byzantium was Scandinavians because they were so tall. Now you're getting much closer to Asia, aren't you? So who knows whether there's a link? A possible argument is that the symbolism of buffalo protection comes from Central Asia and spread both ways. We don't know the answer. It's lost in the mists of time. Now, in Japan, we have very little record of history in early Japan before about the 2nd century AD. And that was because the Japanese didn't have writing. So it's all legends. But what we do have are objects that have been found in graves. And these objects take two forms. Either they're bronze objects, drums, bowls, bells, or they're clay objects. Now, in this cage in a museum in Japan on the left, you can see behind the rather predictable 3-story little building in the foreground, or 2.5-story building, you can see behind it a building that is amazingly like the boat roof buildings we've seen in Indonesia. Here is a not very good slide of it, and it is one of about 20 that have been found that are clay models of buildings with overhanging eaves. This one doesn't have as big an overhanging eaves as the previous one. But still you can see basically it's a thatched roof weighed down by logs at the top with overhanging eaves. When we come to talk about Japanese architecture, I'm going to talk a lot more about these because they are the origins of the earliest Japanese buildings. But what is intriguing is to ask yourself, does that tradition come from further south? Again, the origins of the Japanese people are somewhat shrouded in the mists of time, and it is not clear what percentage of Japanese people might have come from the south and what percentage of Japanese people might have come from the north. But the general opinion at the moment is that it's about 50-50. That is, the Japanese have represent people who migrated up from the south and mixed with people who migrated across from Mongolia and Korea. So there would have been some Indonesian influence, perhaps. But what's more important is to ask, was there Dongsong influence? And then the answer is certainly yes, because we have, of course, all the bronze in the graves, and it's traded bronze. Although the Japanese were very quick to learn all the skills they were presented with, so we know the Japanese were bronze casting very early on. Almost certainly they learnt that from the Dongsong people. In the bronze bells and some of the drums, you get representations of early buildings. They're very raised up with long ladder-like approaches to them, not unlike a gangplank. And then they have definitely overhanging eaves, and the overhanging eaves are supported by freestanding columns. So we're getting very close to the Indonesian president or the Southeast Asian president. But there's further evidence. And as I said, I'll be talking about it a bit more when I come to Japanese architecture. But here is one simple example. They have represented boats in the ridge. There are two ridges at right angles, and both of them represent boats which overhang the ends of the building. These are not in the southern parts of Japan, but in the northern parts, curiously enough, where you have to protect yourself from the cold with very thick thatching, even on the walls. So it is curious to see that the influence of the boat culture seems to extend over the whole of Japan in the end, right up to the north. If you'd been students of architecture in your parents' generation, you would have found the idea of a boathouse, like you've just seen this morning, very strange indeed, very hard to understand, because you had been brought up to think of architecture as essentially, fundamentally determinist, functional. That architecture reflected what we needed in a most direct way as beautifully as we could do it. And this is not what this architecture is about at all. So it becomes very hard to accept it. Maybe it's a little bit easier today because we've been inflicted with the Sydney Opera House and a few buildings like that. But of course we can't really compare the Sydney Opera House to a Dongsong house because it doesn't mean to us what it meant to these people. To these people it was their whole society. Their whole culture was based on the concept of traveling by boat overseas, and when you had a settlement it was organized like a boat. And the members of the settlement were part of the crew of a boat, even though it was on land. That was the way they thought. The same with the Vikings and the Viking holiday houses for the winter. They thought of themselves as still being organized as a crew. So that's very different from Sydney Opera House. But still, the fact remains that it was very hard, it was very hard, I think, for people to come to terms 50 years ago with the idea that there was such a thing as an architecture of a concept and not the architecture of function. Now, where does it come from? Well, it comes from insecurity, I think, ultimately. These Dongsong people were far-flung in remote islands away from where their ancestors had come from, and they were little groups who felt insecure. The Hakka people were the same. They were in an alien land, basically, and they had to protect themselves. So they needed some sort of a protective form that symbolized protection for them. And I think that probably is the secret. We're talking about primitive societies. They don't have much permanent about them. They don't have writing. They don't have a permanent culture. All they have are the legends and the memories. And they protect themselves with these symbols, these concepts which are based on symbols. And so it's easier to understand our primitive societies. So not surprisingly, the generative concept idea rather disappears as societies evolve and become very sophisticated. But are very prevalent, I think, in prehistoric architecture. And a way of understanding prehistoric architecture is to look for them. Now that may take us into several other issues. Another interesting issue is how old is the Dongsong culture? How long ago did they start to spread out across East Asia, taking their bronze goods with them? Well, archaeologists are revising their opinions about many of such things, and not least the Dongsong culture. They don't all agree, of course, about dating, and the systems of dating bronze are not very good. But the general view is that the Dongsong culture probably goes back to 2000 BC. It was thought for a long time that it was only went back to 600 BC, but now they're thinking of it, extending it much further back. And that the bronze casting in that region may be much older than that, is also being accepted. So that's the first issue, is the tendency that's now going on in archaeology to push the dates back a bit. These societies were very long-lasting, and that's partly one of the reasons why the concepts, the symbols are so important. The second thing I want to discuss is the issue of travel by sea. Now, in the 19th century, they didn't bother about this, wasn't a problem. They assumed that civilization had spread, or the societies, I apologize, societies had spread by sea. But now it's not fashionable. It hasn't been fashionable until very recently to accept that societies could have spread by sea. The reason why they didn't think so was that the historical records of travel, certainly of China, in Tang Dynasty China and later on in Ming Dynasty China, are of travel keeping close to the land on the whole and not traveling far out to sea. But in actual fact, that doesn't seem to have been true of ancient man. And the reason is that they were traveling in small boats with outriggers. Now, small boats with outriggers can be very strong, made out of logs. And with the outriggers, they're very stable. They don't turn over easily. And the primitive man lived a very harsh life, which he was very attuned to. And so he was able to lie down in a log boat and sleep perfectly comfortably. And he was also able to catch fish and to eat them without too much difficulty, in a way perhaps that we couldn't. And so he could go out to sea, survive rough weather, sleep overnight out in the boat, and fish for food. So why couldn't he travel long distances? Well, we have the spread of the Polynesians to show how far they could travel. But what we haven't yet come to terms with really is how far did they travel in prehistoric times, in very early times? Well, the question is being raised again because, as you probably know, the two oldest DNA samples that have been found in Australia are second to the Bushman and the Pygmy in Africa in age. That is, they're the two oldest DNA samples that have been found outside of Africa. There's nothing in between. They didn't get to Australia by traveling through Asia. They came on the Roaring Forties, probably blown out to sea in Africa. And because they could survive at sea, they landed in Australia. But they mustn't have done so in just dribs and drabs. There must have been whole numbers of them who did that, to have established societies in Australia. Extraordinary. Now, the same has happened in Peru. They have recently found the oldest American settlement is not in North America, it's in Peru. 40,000 BC. How did they get there? They could only have got there by being blown there, couldn't they? And presumably from Southeast Asia. And that's starting to open up a whole lot of questions again about sea travel. So it's not surprising that the Dongsong people could have been trading from at least 1000 BC, maybe 2000 BC, out into that whole area of the Western Pacific. Quite a thought, isn't it? Yeah.
Just out of interest, what is the oldest DNA sample we have so far for
The oldest?
DNA sample we have
It's in Africa, and it's the Pygmies and the Bushmen. They're both the same group. Well, I'm wrong in saying that. I'm talking about surviving peoples.
Yeah.
The oldest, of course, are in archaeological digs, and they're mostly from Kenya area, around Lake Victoria, that area. Yeah. Sorry, I thought there was another question, wasn't there? No, no other questions. So this idea that we have cultures spreading out in prehistoric times across the world is a very intriguing one, and I think archaeologists are just beginning to come to terms with it, that it may not have been just overland. It may have been by water, and the Dongsong may be a very good early example of it. There is another great mystery, of course. I mean, there are a number in archaeology, but because of the lack of writing, and that is, how did the people of Madagascar come to speak a language which is 50% Indonesian, 50%. Half the modern language of Madagascar is the language of Sumatra, to be precise. And how did that happen? Well, clearly the Sumatrans sailed there, didn't they, in large numbers. And they don't know exactly when. There's a lot of disagreement because we don't have written histories. But it's the current thinking is that it was about 2,200, 2,400 years ago that the Sumatrans had an empire which extended to Africa. So that shows you something about the way in which human beings could travel by water in prehistoric times. The people of Sri Lanka are thought by some anthropologists to be very, very much Indonesian. Not surprising if they were traveling to Africa. And so there's much more mixing and much more travel than we realize. Of course, another curious thing is, what was the extent to which the Greeks and the Romans traded into Asia? Well, we know about Alexander's conquests. Alexander conquered overland to the Indus. But what about beyond that? Did the Greeks and the Romans have settlements in India? Did they trade into India? Well, they found some examples of trading settlements which were Greek and Roman, and not in West India, in East India, and in Sri Lanka. The archaeology's only just begun, you know, and there's only bits of it been done. It needs to be carried on, but it's extraordinary. There was a lot of trade to Asia from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, by water, not by land. And there is a book called The Periplus of the Euphratean Sea, which, again, we don't know exactly when it was written, but the book seems to be about, at latest, about 140 AD, maybe earlier. And it's in Greek, written in Alexandria, ancient Alexandria, and it describes how to navigate to go as far as Ceylon, what was Ceylon, Serendib, and eastern India. So they were clearly doing it a lot. So there was much more interchange of ideas by water than people realized. They now know, for instance, that there was a Buddhist colony in ancient Alexandria. There was also a Buddhist colony in ancient Syria. So when Christ was being educated, one of the influences was Buddhism. Extraordinary, isn't it? Much more cultural interchange than we realize. So all of this is at the cutting edge of discovery. Archaeology is still in a very young stage for us to understand ancient history. And of course the connections between China and Europe are very intriguing, and they are still highly in debate. But certainly existed in ancient Roman times and probably in late Greek times too. And there were direct connections overland through Central Asia. So there was knowledge of what was happening in China and Chinese goods being sold in ancient Rome. They were wearing Chinese silks, and presumably vice versa. Very interesting. So that's probably where we should stop today. And next week we will start with particular cultures in Asia.